Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Shannon Gilreath. Shannon is the professor for the interdisciplinary study of law at the law school and core faculty in the Women's and Gender Studies program. He's the author of 3 books on queer critical theory, practice that, including the discipline-defining textbook, Sexual Identity, Law, and Context, and his most recent book, The End of Straight Supremacy, described by one human rights activist with the United Nations as the most important text in gay and lesbian studies in recent memory, and as imperative reading for anyone who wants to understand LGBT issues and homophobia in an increasingly globalized world. Professor Gilreath served as an advisor to the Pentagon during the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Professor Gilreath, thank you for being with us here today.
Get rid of this a bit and you can still hear me. Any problems hearing me?
Yeah.
A little low. Alright, so I'll move it back. Yeah. Since I scribbled some notes this morning, I'll be mostly looking down. Although I feel like a little like I should be on a pivot here, as this room is. So this talk is of course about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, although I'm going to approach the subject in a way that maybe is a little unexpected.
Let me sort of bracket up front what the talk is not about. And as I see it, this question of whether gay people should serve or be allowed to serve in the U.S. military is really divisible into 2 questions. The first question is the generally accepted question, right? Do gay people have an equality right, constitutional right, to access to the military? And I think the answer to that question is yes. I also think that that's a very important question. It's the question to which most scholarship on this topic has been devoted. And I think it's important because the arguments for exclusion, right, would be strongest in an environment where there could be said to be very special concerns. And so if gay people should not be excluded from this environment where there are very special concerns, if those arguments for exclusion are ultimately unpersuasive in even that environment, right, then it makes them even less persuasive in the wider world, and therefore it makes more comprehensive anti-discrimination law seem more viable. So, in that sense, the possibility of anti-discrimination legislation is strengthened, I think. And I want just to note at this juncture, for any of you who may have been sort of taken in by the propaganda, right, that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was some sort of magnanimous compromise on the part of Congress and the President that allowed gay people access to the military, a world order substantially different than the world before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, in which there was an explicit statutory ban, right? But it's important, I think, to recognize that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was no less a ban on gays, that is, gays qua gays, right, than what preceded it. Because if you condition gay people's access to any given institution on their willingness to disclaim their identity, right, to dissociate from their identity group, you have, in effect, banned gay people. Because the gay identity in a hetero-supremacist culture is a lot like Bishop Berkeley's celebrated tree. It requires a reception, right? So it's a claim to existentiality that one makes in positive, which is to say, in order to have a gay identity, one has to affirm it. One has to claim it. The heterosexual identity, by contrast, is a negative implication, a presumption, a default position, a lie upon which all of society has been based. Slowly, the truth is coming out, and the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was an important step forward in that truth progression. So it was important, and when I was contacted by the Pentagon to give some legal advice on questions that arose in the context of the repeal effort, I thought here's a chance to do something for gay people, so I took it. So I don't want the comments that follow to be construed to believe, or to make it seem that I believe something other than I do. Nevertheless, I am going to argue in the next 30 minutes or so that gay people should not serve in the U.S. military. That in fact they have a normative moral obligation not to serve in the U.S. military. This is the second question. The second question is, having arrived at where we are, which is a place where legal impediments to service have been removed, should gay people serve? And I think the equality dimensions of this question are every bit as important as the equality dimensions of the first question, whether they have a right to serve. Perhaps the equality dimensions are even more important. That is, if one looks at equality as something substantive rather than as something merely formal. And so it's the second question that really most interests me at the moment, and particularly the gay liberation answer to the second question. And you'll see in this talk, in these remarks, that I draw a stark distinction between what I consider the contemporary gay rights movement and gay liberation. I think the two relatively rarely intersect in reality. The modern gay rights movement has been, at least since the 1970s, when the Gay Activist Alliance split from the Gay Liberation Front, governed by a politics that, in my view, values only that which is paradigmatically straight. And so activists in the name of gay people have striven mightily to get gay people into the two institutions through which most of the violence on this planet takes place, the military and the state-sanctioned home. So the second question really is an entree into a more universal critique of the organizing that has led to military access, same-sex marriage, etc., etc. I do want to say, of course, that access to the military is in no way unique to us, to gay people. It has been a part of every civil rights movement. It was a part of the African American civil rights movement. Most recently, it has been a part of the women's movement. When women, to take that as an example, wanted into the military, of course, predictable patriarchal panic ensued, right? The sky is falling, the world is ending, what will we do? No one, though, asked what I thought was a much more interesting question, not why patriarchal people are bigots, but why it was that women would want into the military. So let's think about the reasons, right? I think one reason, if you bracket the fact that there is really nothing remotely revolutionary about the desire to be shot at in defense of a country that routinely tells you it makes no place for you, has no use for you, will not keep you safe in the face of routine, systematic violence on a daily basis, right? So if we bracket that, why would women want in? Well, I think perhaps the perversity of human nature is at work, right? We all want in the places where we aren't wanted. It's a part of human nature. But I also think women wanted in because they legitimately felt they had a right to be there. After all, a free country is a free country, even if it is freer in theory than in fact. So it could be also that women wanted access, right, to the flagship killing machine of the patriarchalists. And under the circumstances in which most women have to live their lives, I think that was an eminently reasonable power grab. If more women had guns, perhaps the world would be a safer place, not a more dangerous one. At any rate, there is certainly no shortage of kitchen knives. On a deeper, though, level, I think women believed, right? Women wanted into the military because they believed in the principle of defending this country's freedom. They believed in the principles the military says it stands for. Unfortunately for women, the male heterosex is most himself when part of an armed mob, however regimented. And so military women quickly found themselves submerged in a storm of misogynist violence. Right now, in a world at war, U.S. military women are more likely to be raped by their fellow male service members than they are to be killed by enemy fire. A 2010 Defense Department analysis of sexual assault in the military reported in 1 year a whopping 19,000 rapes. And this with an acknowledged report rate of only 13.5%. Despite 18 separate reports commissioned by the military on the issue of sexual assault, nothing has changed. In one military study, 2 out of every 3 military women reported being sexually harassed. Think about that. 2 out of every 3 military women reported being sexually harassed. And a lawsuit filed this year against the Department of Defense alleges a culture that encourages rape and sexual assault of female service members and an intentional mishandling of reported cases. Some women who do report, some women who say, we won't take it, right, are discharged from the military for, quote, psychological reasons. Military psychologists apparently believe that when a woman refuses to shut up and take it, she must be crazy. So in the wake of all this unreported and certainly seldom reported on misery, the gays come knocking at the military's door. So politics aside, and I think it is a big aside, we can ask the question, why would gays want into the military? I think the reasons are largely for the same reasons that women want in. Gays want into the military predominantly because they want to serve their country. They want to protect our freedoms. But the past 10 years of working closely with gay people has asked me to question whether this country and its principles that gay people believe they are defending in the uniform of the U.S. military is really a possibility for them under current circumstances. The straight man has invented both the military uniform and the country for which it stands. And gay people, men and women, are already always excluded from this model, no matter what degree of sacrifice they are willing to undertake. We gay people, that is, of course, know this, right? Because having lived a gay person's life in the United States, one is not long naive nor innocent. People who remain so too long wind up dead. So, I think gay people go in standing on principle. The principle that this is indeed the land of the free, that this is worth defending, and that its ideals are worth propagating. The tremendous sadness of it for me is that the distance between these principles and the reality of most gay people's lives right here in this country, and certainly abroad, which I will talk about in a moment, the distance between principle and material reality is measured in heartbreak. Whatever one may have thought about gay people's involvement in the U.S. military before, that is specifically what a gay liberation analysis might have looked like before September 11th, I think things have changed. That U.S. intervention in the Arab regimes of the Middle East and North Africa now necessitate a specific and serious analysis of this normative moral question. The newest phase of U.S. interventionism was sparked by September 11th. We all know that. 2 wars have been launched in its name. So I want to set aside the debate, right, about the efficacy of the U.S. response. That doesn't much interest me now. What's more interesting for me is, and for a gay liberation analysis, is that September 11 has meant that humanitarian calamities caused by non-state actors, and that's important, have been treated as a source of action invoking the response of war. So no parallels are acknowledged, and consequently no war is waged. But gays, too, in this country and abroad, are facing armed attack at the hands of non-state actors. It is an armed conflict, and by most reports, gay people are losing. Yet no humanitarian crisis is acknowledged, so one begins to wonder whether humanitarian crisis is some code word for a time period in which sufficient numbers of straight men are killing each other. Is there one standard for human dignity or not? What does it take to make a humanitarian crisis? The same could be said, I think, about the prevailing international understanding of terrorism, of what it is. In fact, if not in theory, September 11th was a massive assault on civilians by other civilians that prompted a massive response by the US and by governments around the world. So despite mass-scale violence occurring against gays and lesbians, a violence which is, by the way, discernibly escalating around the globe, an increase in the number of reported murders of openly gay people in this country alone spiked 30% between 2009 and 2010. This in the most generous nation on earth. In a country that at home at least is perpetually styled peacetime. I think it's fair for any gay soldier with anything resembling a gay consciousness to ask the question of whether he or she should in fact be a part of this sort of march toward oblivion for gay people. At the level of surface observation, the September 11 attacks do not appear to have much to do, of course, with sex or sexuality. We know that the victims were male and female. We know that they were gay and straight. We know that the heroes were gay and straight, male and female. We know gay people lost their lives in the response to September 11, as did straight people. But just below the surface of September 11, heterosexuality lurks in full-scale operation. The motivating force behind September 11 was an undeniably, paradigmatically heterosexual religious political dynamic. In the context of gay liberation specifically, Harry Hay once adroitly observed that, quote, among the really first-class facilities for maintaining domination, one must rank organized religion at the top. Hay included Islam in his discussion, even way back in the 1970s, because Islam is thoroughly heterosexual. Indeed, those men who successfully murdered thousands of infidels on September 11th had as their promised reward nothing short of a heterosexual male paradise, eternal life among female virgins. This revelation reminded me of the prophecy of Norman Mailer, the West's own patriarchal poet laureate, that murder is never, quote, non-sexual. So, we also have, I think, exposing this minute degree of separation between the Islamic theocracy the hijackers hope to establish and the Christian theocracy at work against gay people in the United States, the performance of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson just days after the Twin Towers crumbled. These prominent spokesmen for Christian terror blamed gay people for the calamity and were as certain in their attacks as the Islamists were in theirs, claiming the same divine revelation that animated September 11. These same Christian theocratic principles that animated Robertson and Falwell dictated official treatment of the surviving same-sex partners of those killed in the disaster. Because same-sex partners are not considered family under federal law, survivors had difficulty obtaining information from airline officials, as well as the $25,000 payment that airlines made to the surviving family members of victims. In addition, the survivors of same-sex partnerships faced special hurdles in claiming monies set aside by the Victims' Compensation Fund, problems compounded and exacerbated by the discrimination inherent in many states' heterocentric inheritance laws. So having been largely invisibilized as September 11's victims and survivors, gays still invisibilized by statute under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, were used in the United States armed response to September 11th, the so-called War on Terror. This war, one which the international law of war, centered as it is on state actors and theaters, had never contemplated, was always characterized as a humanitarian war. First, as a war of defense, but later, specifically with regard to Iraq, as a response to humanitarian crises. Saddam is bad. He mistreats his people, right? This is justification to get rid of him. Good old humanitarianism. More recently, these same sorts of justifications have been offered for U.S. policy in Egypt and for armed intervention in Libya. So if gay people are going to be involved as members of the U.S. military in interventionist campaigns explicitly based in human rights, or at least justified by its rhetoric, then gay people owe themselves and other gay people a critical analysis of the world they are helping to make. There is mounting evidence that the world they are helping to make by participating in the U.S. military is measurably worse for gay people. In Iraq, for example, in 2009, the Human Rights Watch published a report detailing a sweeping campaign of kidnappings, torture, and executions of gay Iraqi men. One such documented killing was that of the partner of a man called Hamid. Hamid's partner was taken from his family's home by an armed gang, and his mutilated body was found the next day. His genitals had been cut off, and a portion of his throat had been ripped out. Iraqi doctors told Human Rights Watch about men being executed by having glue injected up their anuses. The murderers sometimes make pornography of this gruesome torture murder, and even when they are not murdered, gay men are routinely beaten, raped, and tortured in Iraq. When usually through plain luck the target escapes, the same sick religious fervor that drives these roving death squads motivates families to turn their gay children out. Most are left with no place to go, and they have little help of escaping. Nobody knows, of course, exactly how many men have been killed by Iraq's roving death squads, but in a matter of months, just a matter of months in 2009, estimates by Human Rights Watch were over 500. What's clear is that these killings are targeted predominantly at gay men, and while not specifically for their anti-gay tactics, Human Rights Watch points out that the same militias behind the murder campaigns have been tacitly supported by the powers that be of the U.S. occupation, and Iraqi police and security forces have turned a blind eye. Some reports suggest that the Iraqi police and security forces are directly involved in the killings and abuse. Reports by Iraqi LGBT, a gay advocacy organization, and Amnesty International reported some 128 men on Iraq's death row who have been convicted of nothing more than homosexuality. These observations, unqualified, ought to be disturbing enough. But it's important to remember, especially in the context of my analysis here, that American military interventionism and occupation, particularly in Iraq, have made things worse for gay people. This is, I recognize, a big statement, and I don't make it without some evidence. Before the first American invasion, the Persian Gulf War, things were very different in Iraq. A thriving gay subculture was available to Iraqi gays. Nightclubs and cafes that catered to gay clientele. Gay men were, for the most part, allowed to flout gender conventions without serious repercussion. And even though Saddam attempted after the first U.S. invasion to consolidate his power over fundamentalist religious interests by allowing sort of sporadic persecution of gays, homosexuality was by and large tolerated in Saddam's Iraq. The BBC documentary Gay Life After Qassam reports that all of the gay Iraqis interviewed maintained that gay life was easier for them when Saddam Hussein was in power, from 1979 to 2003. There's even evidence that the U.S. military has played an active part in the growing persecution. taunting gay Iraqis, and more dangerously, spreading news of their whereabouts. Most of them have to exist now in safe houses, and so when they are discovered by elements of the U.S. military, this news goes out to the community so that these death squads can find them. What seems like high school gossip is tantamount to a death sentence in this culture, and everybody knows it. I think this is, or this too, ought to give gay service members pause, because it is, in my view, merely a reflection of a military culture in which to harass, belittle, and humiliate in the name of gender or sexuality is simply a part of the climate that makes the perpetrator of this kind of heterocratic violence a good soldier, or a good American, or just one of the boys. It's a climate that renders the military an acutely unsafe place to be when one is gay. Terrorization of gay people is also a long-standing tradition of Islamist governments the U.S. has used as puppets, and those it has established in occupied countries. In the Egyptian government of Hosni Mubarak, for example, a long-time ally of the U.S., gays were routinely harassed, tortured, and murdered by the government. In the power vacuum created by the transitional government after Mubarak is toppled, various Islamic factions vie for power, and there has been an uptick in anti-gay rhetoric, scapegoating, and violence. So when President Obama speaks of what he called, quote, the universal human rights of the Egyptian people, one has to wonder who qualifies. When he condemned the Mubarak regime's violent reaction against Egyptians in Tahrir Square in January 2011, expressing that his, quote, first concern was preventing injury or loss of life, even a gay liberationist with a strong stomach and a grip on reality begins to feel a little nauseous. Can it be true that gay is not a suitable referent for human in U.S. foreign policy? And from Libya, we get reports of escalating anti-gay scapegoating by the Gaddafi loyalists and by the rebels. Saudi Arabia, right, our long-term ally, supposedly our closest ally in the region, makes homosexuality a capital crime. Gay men are publicly executed. The president wrings his hands piously over Uganda, but there is Saudi Arabia. Likewise, Kuwait, another ally, one we notably saved from Saddam's megalomania, remember, in the Persian Gulf War, has recently enacted amendments to its criminal code to make punishment for homosexuality even harsher. My question for gay people is, as gay people, shouldn't we care? Shouldn't we at least acknowledge a shared transnational identity, the common link of which is oppression at the hands of straight supremacy, whether it's called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or Islam? And these are not rhetorical questions. These observations, I think, raise an extremely important query, and that is, what is terror? And why doesn't what is done to us count? One barrier to having gay experiences taken seriously in American international humanitarian interventionism is that the legal basis for intervention, however arguable, has been sketched with war, with armed conflict in mind. Mostly what is done to gay people is made to seem random, not systematic, not systemic, as it is in fact. Consequently, it doesn't look like any war we've known or named. Additionally, war or armed conflict, at least those conditions sufficient to constitute it from the perspective of international law, has always been defined in distinctly masculine or heterocratic terms. As I said before, war is generally regarded as a distinct period in which heterosexual men are killing each other for some overtly political purpose. Everything else is denominated peacetime, regardless of how many of those of us without the distinctly heterosexual male power of naming or access to the machinery of war have to die in any given day or year during this peacetime. Thus, Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, providing protections for civilians during conflicts that are not among nations, protections thought to be the floor of what is due civilians engulfed by armed conflict, is not operable for most of what gays suffer in epochs denominated, however briefly, times of peace. Common Article 3 provides by letter much of what gay people need, including prohibitions on violence to the person, particularly torture, cruelty, humiliation, degradation, and murder. As such, the law of war technically provides for gays in zones of combat the basic protections of human dignity that the laws of peacetime do not. In peacetime and in wartime, gays are under attack. Gays are not usually armed, and the ways in which gays are systematically killed, the methods of destruction employed, often do not match the ordinary definition of arms, or almost certainly of armed conflict. And as an interesting point about here at home, the new hate crimes prevention law, the celebrated Shepard-Byrd Act, actually requires that assaults be armed in order for the maiming and murder that they do to be cognizable under the Act. Still, the law usually finds a way to go where it wants to go. We see this with the relatively recent horrors of Somalia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Kosovo in the 1990s, where a shift in humanitarian interventionist thinking takes place, specifically with regard to the coercive interference of states in the domestic affairs of other states when they refuse to protect their citizens, or when they are in fact perpetrating violence against their citizens. As it eventually appeared in the United Nations, the responsibility to protect emphasizes the responsibility, quote, of each state to protect its populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. This responsibility entails the prevention of such crimes, including their incitement, which is a big difference from the homicidal view of free speech most Americans take, including their incitement through necessary and appropriate means. Of course, the responsibility to protect has never been invoked in the name of gay lives. There is, however, if the Geneva Convention set no limits and the responsibility to protect is largely unimplemented, a particularly well-settled aspect of international law that should be applicable to what gay people face in many locations, and that is genocide, the prohibition on genocide. The Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines genocide, quote, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, as acts intended to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The omission of gays, of course, from that list of protected categories underlines that gay people must become cognizable from the perspective of people in power, as a group, as a humanity, in a way that recognizes a gay identity beyond mere performativity, before gays' destruction on the basis of their group reality is cognizable as such. I don't think it's unfair for me to say that that moment has not come, not in the United States or in any place under the sun. Mostly, people will say that international humanitarian law should not respond to gay people's crisis, because to do so would be imperial, would be colonial. It would be to interfere with cultural and religious norms that ought not to be interfered with. But it is curious, to me at least, especially in our post-September 11th world, that the systematic intrusion on the human rights of some men will eventually make for a politics worthy of international support, along the way to vindication of rights that we all supposedly share. Yet, when gays and women are degraded, violated, physically intruded upon, it is still called culture, the latest cover for standing by, with the common feature of this relativist cover underlining the link between gender and sexuality-based violence and the impunity for both in law and culture, that which Andrea Dworkin once named when she noted women and men's, gay men's, that is, quote, union in queerness. I do just want to say briefly that although I think that post-September climate abroad might be the number one reason that gay people should forgo military service. Specifically, that is, they would be cooperating in an imperialism that is in fact making the world worse for most gay people. There is reason enough at home to make a gay person think twice before enlisting. Gay people in the United States are the victims of violent crime in staggering numbers. Statistically, gay people report an exponentially higher rate of crimes against the person, against the body, than does any other minority group. Gays are about 2.5 times more likely to report a hate-based attack on the body than are members of other minority groups. 2.5 times greater. And of course, many, 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 many more times greater than the general population. We know, of course, that women and men are killed for being gay because occasionally the media departs from the norm and reports on it. Yet the hermetic precision of what I like to call the heterarchy as a system of governance ensures that we may never know the truth about the frequency or horror of these crimes. If the real facts, including the numbers, were known, no one, at least certainly no gay one, would sleep at night. When you couple that with the closely related and equally underreported aspect of what happens to gay people in this country, that is the epidemic of gay suicide, particularly among gay youth, you note that gay youth are 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers and may account for as much as 30% of the completed youth suicides in this country annually. Here in our peaceful, peacetime order, as the most generous nation on earth, what looks like every day to most people is to others an open season. But as horrible as this reality is for gays in the United States, we are lucky that those who would like to see us destroyed are still slightly more constrained by the rule of law than are those who would otherwise kill and abuse gay people in many Islamist countries. The question for gay people is, how long can we go on pretending not to notice? How many more bodies will it take in event? How long can we go on celebrating the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell without facing up to what is actually happening in a part of the world we are simultaneously colonizing and courting? I do not believe that any gay American should be part of a foreign policy that refuses to acknowledge the exigency of the circumstances of our sisters and brothers abroad. Just to conclude, I want to say I recognize, certainly it has not escaped me, that these observations will look like, to many of you, if not most of you, bitterness. But they're actually the product of something much simpler and more emotional than that. That's sadness. In many ways, I think the gay civil rights movement is following the paths of the other civil rights movements, the African American movement, the women's movement. And I think what's problematic about that is that those movements, at least in their contemporary mainstream incarnations, have become movements in which the basis for measuring progress has become individual exceptionality. It's a way for powerful people at the top, the tokens, right, to be able to celebrate their tokenhood while the people at the bottom are left in relatively bad shape. This is happening with the gay rights movement today. My sadness stems from my hope that the gay movement would have been different, that it would stand for something more than what gay rights has come to. Instead, I think the gay rights movement has amounted to a devaluing of gay liberation principles following straight priorities. Harry Hay observed in the 1970s that, and this is a quote from Harry Hay, after Stonewall, gay liberation was indeed a rebellion against the hetero, male-oriented systems of laws. But the rebellion itself developed in terms of hetero, male-oriented cultural values. Within 5 years, the dominant gay assimilationist culture had gutted it, just as they had gutted the homophile movement 20 years before. The fetish for military service is, in my view, the penultimate expression, and I say penultimate because I believe marriage is the ultimate expression, of that which Hay named the dominant gay assimilationist culture. In admonishing gays to embrace the long-ignored positive aspects of perceiving equality in unhetero ways, Hay quoted another of my heroes, Frederick Douglass, for the proposition that gays need to rediscover our own way to rise the, and this is the Douglass quote, to rise the immeasurable distance from our knees to our feet. I think at least gay people now should acknowledge that our participation in the U.S. military under present conditions is keeping many other gays around the globe on their knees. And that result might sit perfectly well with gay rights priorities, but it cannot be countenanced by gay liberation. I'm still clinging to my hope in the latter, and to my concomitant hope that our social movement might prioritize something as simple and yet as revolutionary as human compassion in law and in life. But of course, a reorganization of priorities along the lines I have sketched will require of gay people and their leaders a tremendous degree of existential courage, because the romance of treason seldom occurs to gay people. Because, as James Baldwin once observed, you can't betray a country you don't have. Think about it. And I thank you for this time. I've been told I should take some questions, although perhaps, given what I've said, I shouldn't. I do want to say that I'm happy to take questions about anything, right? I mean, this is the area to which I devote most of my time and waking hours. And as Fonda Balzano, my co-conspirator in 3 a.m. instant messaging, can tell you, probably some hours I should spend sleeping. I'm happy to answer questions about any issue that relates to gay rights, gay and lesbian people. One thing I learned in the process of establishing a gay lesbian center on campus is just how impoverished the discourse on this campus is about these issues. So I'm happy to have a much broader discussion than just about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So, question? Yeah.
So, Shannon, I love your analysis of this, and I guess I have two questions, and one is to play devil's advocate here. You know, what is the potential role of changing military culture by having gays and lesbians openly serving within it? And then my second question sort of pushes you a little bit more in the other direction, and you know, if we say that as gays, we have a moral obligation not to serve a military that doesn't serve our interests. And, you know, in a country that ignores acts of violence against whole communities, I mean, I really think that you can extend that argument far past the gay community, really to most communities of color, immigrant communities, and poor people overall. And
women.
So, yeah,
Certainly
I mean,
women.
So not to put you on the spot here, but I sort of feel like what you're arguing for is an overthrow of the military-industrial complex as we know it, and perhaps capitalism.
I'm going to take these questions in reverse. The second question is, am I arguing for an overthrow of the military-industrial complex and capitalism? I am not making that argument, although I wouldn't get in the way. So I'll just leave that there. The first question, tell me more about what you mean.
Well, sure. I mean, you know, when we think about these institutions, the military, any place, like part of how institutional change occurs is through its actors and its participants.
I see. You mean
yeah.
the ethos within the military itself.
Well, the ethos within the military, both in terms of larger sort of structural policy decisions, but I also mean in a very tangible way what happens on the street. If you have gay soldiers in Iraq saying, yo, that's really messed up, you can't tell people where those gay people are, I mean, isn't there possibility for change on a sort of quotidian level?
I
If not a larger
suppose.
focus.
I guess the question is, and this is always the question, right? I mean, when we ask people to make those sacrifices, we're rarely the people making them. And I'm glad you brought that up because I have one little example here. Recently, there was a Russian-American soldier referred to as a commie faggot, and then gang raped by fellow soldiers at Fort Benning. When he reported this, and of course we know that it is normally not reported, but when he reported this, the response of his commanding officer was, quote, "It must have been your fault. You must have provoked it." In a recent episode, I believe that the military base was in Washington State. Well, I'm not quite certain about that. But at any rate, a service member was beaten to death with a baseball bat by his, I guess, barrack mate and friend. And when the military did its survey of the base, it reported that there was no unusual degree of homophobia. Perhaps it's the usualness of the degree of homophobia that ought to disturb us, right? So I understand what you mean. The more gay people, I mean, surveys bear this out, right? If you know a gay person, you're less likely to be homophobic, you're less likely to do things against gay people's interests. I get that. Although I do think in terms of foreign policy, we don't see it bared out in what's happening in material reality, what's happening on the ground. We also, I mean, the military is not a place, right, where we express our opinion. Soldiers are locked in to their deployment and locked out of the public debate. And so I really think it's an environment really that cabins the potential for revolutionary voice more than it facilitates. So I think you're probably right. There is some measurable progress within the institution by having openly gay people, but I don't think it outweighs the negative impact that our participation creates.
Shannon, is there more to the story of the rape than the commanding officer, or did it stop there?
Well, it wasn't a commanding officer.
Could you repeat that a little louder?
My question was the story of the soldier who was repeatedly raped, and the commanding officer said you must have provoked it, as I understood it, or his CO or whatever.
Yeah, the more to the story is a lawsuit, but there was no more to the story as far as the military was concerned.
So the military took no further action.
And this is typical. I mean, we see this, we have the paradigm for this with the way the military has treated women. So the way they treat gay men is essentially no different. It's the response they give to everybody who's alien to the gender frame. And in this case, gay men are alien to that frame from the perspective of the military, I would say from the perspective of most of society, in the same way that women are alien. That's what Dworkin means when she says women and gay men are united in their queerness, right? We're total outsiders to the way law is organized and to the way it operates.
If it's the case that I'm remembering discussing about.
Amy was my research assistant over the summer.
Oh, good.
So I've researched a lot of cases like that, but I think that they did a very cursory investigation at that phase. And by cursory, I mean they maybe asked one or two questions and then left alone the commanding officer and then, the officers under him. But it really nothing. The military did nothing. They didn't court martial, they didn't hold any kind of hearing. It was nothing.
And
It's the usual very minimal
was the
response.
suit against then the commanding officer? Because I thought you
That happened
almost
to me
can't
twice
do
this
that.
morning in a meeting, so I understand.
I think it was against the officers that actually raped him, I believe, in this case. But in order to investigate the tolerance for gay people at that army base, they referred to an officer who reported that there was no issues.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, where would you draw the line? If you say a gay person cannot be commander-in-chief, for example.
The gay person could not be commander, as in president?
Yeah, or the Joint Chiefs. Could a gay person not sit there? And does it go all the way to the top, or?
Yes, I think it does.
So you think a gay person cannot be president?
I mean, I think the ability of Could a gay person be president? Certainly not.
Well, of course,
for
could, but
reasons
should a
largely
gay-
unrelated to this, right?
Right, but
Should a gay person be president? I mean, you know, somebody who is the president has the power to set foreign policy priorities, right? So if we had a gay person as president, quite apart from their figurehead role as commander-in-chief, right? Perhaps we've had a shift in priorities. But, you know, it's hard to, I mean, let me put it this way. I'd love to see a gay president, but not just any gay president, right? I mean, it all depends on where they believe their loyalties lie. And if it is to the system that largely has promoted them to that place, then I'm not sure it would fix them.
And then you would say that about the joint chiefs.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, do you think the military would be a safer place for gay servicemen and women if Don't Ask, Don't Tell had not been repealed?
No, because it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't in the sense. I mean, I do think. I guess it depends on how we define safe, right?
Yeah.
Prior to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there was the same culture of victimization of gay service members, because you know, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was something of a fiction, right? I mean, people knew who the gay service members were in many cases, so it was something of a fiction in that sense. I do think that what you will see after the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell is probably a spike in the violence. For the same reason that you see a spike in the violence against gay and lesbian people over the past decade, supposedly our rights decade, right? It's because the more, remember, it's the gay identity and Bishop Berkeley's treat, right? The more you are perceived, the more a target you become. And so I suspect that's what we'll see with respect to this.
Are you not concerned that when you remove gay men and women from serving, that the end result is silencing their rights and perhaps creating a separate or equal environment where maybe there's a gay army as opposed to a straight army?
Oh, from your lips to God's ears. We're a gay army. In full support. In fact, perhaps a gay nation state with guns, lots of guns.
It's worked so well for straight people to have all these guys.
Well, it hasn't worked well for gay people. For straight people themselves, we could have an argument. I think the greater risk of silence is once gay and lesbian people are part of the military. Because, as I say, the military is not the place for debate about international policy decisions. Right? I mean, I fully support gay people forcing themselves into international policy debates, perhaps with tactics not like ACT UP and other AIDS groups in the 1980s and 90s. But I don't think, you know, getting gay people into the military gives them any greater voice. In fact, I think it probably limits individual voices and therefore collective voice. Other questions? I'm surprised no one's asked me about Amendment 1. Yes?
Well, now I want to ask you about Amendment 1.
Well, you can ask two questions then. What was your first question?
Well, I was wondering what the story you told about the officer being raped in Washington State. It just seems like that's a homosexual act in and of itself to rape another officer. So are those straight men persecuting the homosexual by engaging in a homosexual act?
In Washington, if I'm remembering the state correctly, he wasn't raped, he was murdered. It was at Fort Benning that the service member was raped. Is it a homosexual act? I think it's a thoroughly heterosexual act. Because anywhere sex is experienced as violence, right? Violence, and that's the old canard about rape. You know, that rape is not about sex, it's about violence. It's not. It's about sex, which is violence, right? Sex experienced as violence, which does violence, is violence. And I think wherever you see that dynamic at work, wherever the penis is used as a weapon, the ultimate weapon, perhaps, heterosexuality is at work. even when on the surface it takes the form of the metonym for the gay identity, which is sodomy. I think it nevertheless is thoroughly heterosexual in its ethos. Other questions?
I've got one. Should we be concerned about stigmatizing big groups of people? Like the way gay people...
Should we be concerned about...
Stigmatizing big groups of people, like the way gay people have been stigmatized, and black people, and immigrants, and poor people, and you name it. And if we should we be concerned about these broad generalizations about straight people and hetero people?
Well, I mean, I take it from that comment you're concerned about broad generalizations about straight people. I mean, from my vantage point, straight people have a lock on the media. They have a lock on this world's propaganda machinery, namely organized religion. So if they desire to combat, as they do, my lone voice crying in the wilderness, right, they can do so with a heavy hand. So, I recognize some of the characterizations I make about straight people, about straight supremacy, are taken personally. I don't mean them personally. I don't personify them. My observations are structural observations. They are commentaries on power and how it operates in material reality. I don't suggest that every straight person is individually violent against gay people. I suggest that straight supremacy, that the governing ethos of straight people, as a collective, inheres in violence against gay people. So, I think that one has to investigate, analyze, and indeed criticize the structure if one is going to create change. And as I see it, my job is not to pat individual straight people on their backs and say, "Oh, good for you for not being, for being a gay ally or for being less regulatory than you can be under current conditions." My job is to point to an emergency. That's what I do. And so if individuals are offended along the way, well, that's life. Yeah.
I was wondering, because you talk a lot about how, you have to throw off tokenism and how, you kind of need to change the way the gay movement is going, the leadership of the gay what they need to make a different direction. What are some couple of steps that you think that they should do to take? Because it's really, I feel like that with all movements, it comes a point where you kind of just flow into the mainstream and everything stays, and and it's just, it comes to the point where it is that tokenism, but then it's like, okay, there's a problem, but how do you make that actual concrete shift?
Right.
Because it's, you know what I mean? It's
a very complicated, it's a complicated question and an even more complicated answer. I mean, I think, the gay movement began in the 70s as a movement from the bottom up. And any social movement, any movement for change that's going to matter and that's going to last and be meaningful has to start by empowering the most powerless first. And gay liberation began as that kind of movement. But what happened in the early 1990s with the sort of crystallization of the AIDS crisis was that crisis was leveraged by the heterocrats as a way to say, it's time for you to abandon gay community. It's time for you to be domesticated. It's time for you to get on with our program, right? And look, if you don't, the wages of sin is death, right? Essentially, that's what they said. I mean, the propaganda machinery around the AIDS crisis, the way it was used to oppress gay people, is, if one is being honest, not generous, just honest, on the part of straight supremacists, a work of sheer genius. And so what it did was it pushed gays into more heterocentric ways of organizing and of setting their goals. So the goals became marriage, for example. The goals became being part of the gender paradigm, right? In this new book that just came out, The End of Straight Supremacy, I criticize same-sex marriage, gay pornography, and transsexualism as though they are part of the same thing, which I see as the derailment of the gay rights movement, of the gay liberation movement, the devaluing, as I said, along straight priorities. Because a movement that once said marriage is a system of sexual slavery, gender should be destroyed, depictions of gay sexuality along straight scripts should be rejected. This movement has been smothered to death by the movement for marriage, the movement for gender conformity, the movement, certainly in legal circles, the movement that calls pornography, for example, free speech. So I think gay people have to sort of double unthink what's happened over the past 3 decades to figure out where the trajectory goes. And I think a huge part of the problem is that nobody is willing to do that. I mean, you know, the fact that I'm crying for their souls, right, has hardly sparked a movement. I'm waiting. Yeah.
First thing I want to say is, in the midst of all that is, there has also been some great steps that have been made, some great accomplishments that have happened through LGBT and Q studies and queer theory. There's been some wonderful steps. I, as an African American gay pastor, pastoring a church right here in Winston-Salem, an open and affirming church for 10 years, that's a huge thing. Not praising self, but just speaking of the accomplishments that have been made within the community.
Right.
Because that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say is sort of posing sort of too much of a question. As I listen to you speak about the military and talk about really basically that gays should not even want to serve in the military. I also think about within the church community and in religious sects, how that the question is often posed, should same-gender loving people stay in traditional churches? Should they, do they have a place? Does my presence in the traditional church, within the traditional church, does it bring about a sphere of change, a sphere of influence to bring about a change because I stay present? Or should I abandon that oppressive place, an oppressive theology, that place that has been oppressive to me, and go somewhere where I am celebrated?
Right.
How do you feel about that in relationship to those two places?
Right, I understand your question. The first part of your question is a very good one. Am I ignoring the progress that's been made? I'm not ignoring the progress we've made. I am fully cognizant and fully willing to celebrate the progress that's been made. I just want us also to keep in mind how far we have yet to go, right? And this is largely a question of how one measures progress. And it is essentially, I think, the demarcation between liberals and radicals. You know, every once in a while in a class evaluation, some student writes, "This guy's a raving liberal." I take offense to that. I'm not a liberal, I'm a radical. I probably claim that. Liberals count noses, right? They count noses, and they say, "Oh, look, gay people are in places they have never been before. That's progress." They don't stop to notice whether the body the nose is attached to is living or dead. Radicals count bodies. And I say, given the facts that I just read to you, we have a long way to go, right? And we can't, those of us who are privileged enough not to every day feel that we are at any moment the target of violence. We can't say, "Oh, look, we've succeeded," and just, oh, but that person over there, just ignore what's happening to them. Gay liberation says, "I notice that person. I want that person back." So that's the answer to the first part of the question. The second part about religion, I mean, I'm just loath to get into a discussion of religion. My perspective on traditional religion is that is God-centered religion, is that it is a glorification of the heterosexual myth. And it's not a religion made for me by anyone who looks like me, and I'm not interested in any part of it. But I'm not passing judgment on people who are. I'm just saying, for me, I'm not interested in celebrating the myth of the omnipotent heterosexual male, and so I stay out of it. This last question. We're over time. Last question.
So given what you said a few moments ago about the sort of push for same-sex marriage might actually be sort of prescribing people to a form of legalized slavery as such, would you then actually advocate that for all, straight or gay, we attempt to eliminate marriage? Or is it better within the social constructs where marriage provides legal protections for partners? Is it better to try to get same-sex marriage, or is it...
I have never suggested that gay people should not be interested in the bundle of rights that is triggered by the word marriage in contemporary statutory law. I understand the impulse to that. I mean, for whatever irrational reason, the government has decided to subsidize coupling, right? Then gay people deserve to get those rights when they couple. What I have criticized is what's going on in California, right? Where their domestic partnership scheme gave to gay people identical, I mean, that's a word from the statute, identical rights of heterosexual married couples. And they've spent $40 million litigating a word because they think, I can't be valuable unless I look and sound and walk and quack like straight people, right? And that's what I'm resistant to. I'm resistant to that. In terms of what straight people should do about marriage, again, I mean, there's so much room for misinterpretation here, but I'm not concerned with straight people's capacities or what they do. What I know is that marriage is bad for gay people, and therefore I think it deserves a more critical analysis than it's gotten from the movement's leadership. Thank you very much for coming.